phi to 0 if you don't use that as the material from a certain sector. Okay, so what is important to note here is that basically firms do not care about how households provide the mix of labor services. They just post the wage, as I was saying, per efficient unit of labor, and households provide the labor services that firms are demanding, and there could be a different mixes of effort and number of hours depending on the preferences of the household and the environment in a particular moment of time. So measured TFPJ in this setup will be equal to this productivities, this like true technological component CJ, and the product of effort per hour, like effort per hour to the power of gamma J, which is the importance of labor in this industry, and mu and UJT, which is factor capital utilization, to the power of the importance of capital in this particular production function. So the frictions that firms face here are, as I was saying, they will face a quadratic capital adjustment cost because they are firms are the ones supplying capital to the market. So sorry, not utilizing the capital more or less intensively, and so there has to be a motive for using it more or less intensively. Otherwise, you would just adjust on the extensive margin. And these are going to be the standard way that you see in RBC models. And in UJT is going to affect the depreciation rate. This is not, there's nothing surprising here. Inside U would be the coefficient associated to the convexity of this depreciation rate. Okay, copper prices and interest rates is like the last part of the model. We have that copper prices will be stochastic and it will follow an AR1 processing logs. And we'll have that the interest rate in the economy will be in the spirit of the Schmidt-Rohen-Uribe. So we will have that will depend on the international interest rate on these risk-free bonds, and there will be a premium that will depend on the number of assets, the amount of assets accumulated. Okay. Now let's dive into the quantitative analysis. To finish, so I calibrate the parameters, taking some of from the literature and others like directly from the data. So basically we have that sigma is equal to 2, which is like the CRA term in the utility, in the period utility, in the CRA period utility. There are others that basically, okay. So I was saying like JT and JNT, which are basically like the number of sectors that are tradable or non-tradable in the IO tables. And this will depend, of course, on my definition of what is tradable and non-tradable, which we can discuss later, but basically will be 29 tradable sectors and 14 non-tradable sectors. Okay, so let me, and there are others that will depend on a steady state conditions. And finally, like the two important ones are psi n and psi e, which basically I will set depending on the coefficient alpha 2 that you saw earlier for the wealth effect channel. Okay, and I estimate the parameters of the AR1 process for copper prices, which yield those numbers. So the calibration is quite okay. I target very well the response of employment, and I managed to have a coefficient for revenue TFP that it's within one standard deviation of what you see in the data. Sorry. And finally, let me get to the results. So to be able to take questions. So we have a real GDP here. Here I fit the model with the actual evolution of copper price shocks for this period, and I compare what you see in the data with what the model spits out. So you see that there is a positive correlation between copper price shocks and revenue copper price shocks and real GDP in here. But you see that real GDP is more in the model is more volatile than in the data. Similarly, we see a positive correlation, that is something that is not that surprising, but similarly here we see a positive correlation between copper price shocks and revenue TFP, which is something that you didn't encounter before. And you see that also it's more volatile than in the data. So basically, just to wrap up, we have that variable factor utilization can rationalize to an important extent the association between commodity price shocks and TFP. I show some results that lend plausibility to this mechanism. And I showed that results. I showed results that a model without factor utilization generates less induced volatility in GDP and TFP relative to a model with this feature. And given what I find, I say this is something very important. Copper price shocks are important drivers of the dynamics of Chilean labor productivity. Okay, so now I can go to questions in the minutes that are left.
Thank you, Gustavo.
Or if it was too fast.
We have just two. Well, in strictly speaking, no time, but let's give 1 or 2 minutes for questions if you have any question there. My only question would be, if I can, you showed how the model replicates these moments. Like, for example, the one that is interesting is the mechanism of the productivity, the factor utilization. What happens when you shut that down? You shut it down, right? So you don't have factor utilization in the model.
Yeah, I have those results here.
Okay.
Basically, this is like without variable factor utilization. So model, this is like basically running the model without variable factor utilization, and that's that, and that's the model. And this is for TFP. For TFP, it's a bit less clear, but it's still, you see that it's less volatile.
Okay, that's the one that I was interested. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, sorry, we are running out of time. Miguel, can you share your screen?
Yeah, definitely.
Sure.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, everyone.
I have a couple of questions,
now,
but I think I'll do the Gustavo in the
WebEx. If we, yeah, or we can leave some time at the end of the whole session to discuss, because we started 2 minutes late anyways. Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Miguel Acosta. And now from the Central Bank of Chile will present the paper New Shocks Across Countries. Thank you, Miguel. We have 20 minutes presentation and 5 minutes for discussion at the end.
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you, Jorge. I appreciate it. I'll try to keep it short. It's a little bit hard. Okay, so this is a joint work with Marius Menhai from one university, and the usual disclaimer applies. So basically, just to some people are usually not familiar with the literature, but we think about contemporary stochastic process, an AR1 process, say of TFP, which is AT plus J, and it's an AR1, so it's in terms of AT plus J minus 1, and 2 disturbances. Usually we have the contemporary disturbance, but when we think about new shocks, it's breaking it down into different disturbances. For instance, the contemporary one, period T plus J as well, and one that occurs J periods before. And this is usually auto-identified in an AR1 because we only have one time series. So one path to identify these new shocks, which are J period anticipated shocks to any stochastic process driving the business cycle, is to use VAR methods. So with that in mind, what VAR evidence shows is that on average, new shocks to TFP explain 15 to 50% of output variance in some developed countries. So for those that these studies have been made, usually Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, small open economies in general, and also the United States as well. And for new shocks to commodity terms of trade, explain about 30% of output variance in some emerging countries, usually commodity producers and exporters such as Colombia, Chile, and others. The thing is that these methods rely on VAR estimations, which are usually subject to small sample bias. So the first thing that motivates the study is, okay, what happens when we take that into account? Second, when we think about new shocks, usually people think about new shocks to TFP. In the US, it's relatively standard economically to think about that. Let's say driverless cars or something, but in emerging markets, it's harder to think economically what a new shock means to TFP. So what if we break down into different sources that are more easy to identify in markets, and what kind of new shocks do we have there? What if we have many countries instead of some countries in the literature, 5 or 6, which are usually the countries that have been studied there? And do these new shocks have different roles in explaining the business cycle in developing countries as opposed to developed? If so, which ones and why does this happen? So what we do here is that regarding the small sample bias, we develop a bootstrap after bootstrap type of bias correction method. It's just an improvement of the standard bias correction methods that apply for VARs, but not so much for the VARs that we can apply in these new shock identification methods. When we think about news of what, we explore TFP news shocks using TFP from the 10 world tables, but also shocks to foreign interest rates and commodity terms of trade, which are drivers of the business cycles in the small open economies that have been identified by previous literature. We work with more than 80 countries. And then when we study if new shocks matter more in developing countries than developed, we find that this is the case indeed for new shocks to foreign interest rates and commodity terms of trade, but not so much for TFP. And the reasons behind that, a very simple correlational, let's say, estimation, is that countries with more level of financial development, meaning more access to savings in banking and so on, have less share of variance of output explained by new shocks to foreign interest rates. And with respect to terms of trade, countries with more total tax of commodities, which is no surprise, have more share of variance explained of output explained by new shocks to commodities, and with more financial markets development, such as derivative markets, have less share of variance explained by new shocks to commodities. So in terms of implications, and this is preliminary because this is a model that we have been working on, is that a two-sector model with exogenous hedging, specifically commodity producers can hedge some of the price in commodity markets, in derivatives markets, and also importers can do that. And more financial participation in the form of more financially included households rationalizes the facts on this simple regression. And this can help us to explain the usual puzzle of emerging markets, that volatility of consumption is larger than that of output. So just
Miguel,
see,
I have like a very basic question that maybe I missed maybe you said it, but I missed it. So what would be a TFP news shock? I mean, like it's something like, hey, you're gonna get productive in next year, something like that. How do you know that will happen? Yeah,
that's a great point. I mean, the literature usually points out to specific examples. Like for instance, Bedouin Portier talked that in the 80s, you knew that they were gonna launch a bunch of satellites. So in the future, you know, the satellites were gonna be out there in space, and that will drive productivity up, allegedly. But the point here is actually that is hard to define, especially in emerging markets, right? Like a driverless car or something like that. So that's one of the reasons why we ask, okay, news of what, right? And we try to explore other news shocks that are more easily identifiable in terms of economics. Valerie Rami has a great paper in the QJE where she thinks about news shocks, right, as news of giant oil discoveries. But in terms of TFP, to be honest, in economic terms, it's a very dark cloud, right? But it's a fair question. So in terms of identifying the new shocks, we use Barsky and Sims. This is the forecast error for the composition of, let's say, variable I, let's say GDP, due to shock J. And what this is choosing a decomposition where you can maximize, or where you can identify the contribution of the current an unexpected shock to TFP or commodity prices or foreign interest rate, which is the exogenous shock, as well as the new shock, which is these two. So the sum of variance explained by those two shocks over its sum variable should be 1. So this turns out to be a maximization problem. I'm not gonna dig into the explanation because I will lose all the time that I have. But the point here is that these estimates are based on VAR estimates, and hence they're subject to small sample bias. So what we do is that we develop a bootstrap method after Killian. The thing is that the VAR method, the VAR identification that we have from Barsky and Sims, is something that you can freely use even if time series have a trend. Regardless of they're stationary or not, the method will work. However, typical bootstrap correction methods, they don't work with VARs that are subject to series that have a trend. So this method developed by Killian works pretty well. And the flavor that what we do here is that you estimate the VAR, you bootstrap the standard errors and re-estimate the VAR 1,000 times and calculate the typical small sample bias. Then you apply a special correction to avoid for explosive coefficients, and then you do it again, basically. Re-estimate VAR, bootstrap standard errors, re-estimate VAR 2,000 times, and then for each of the 2,000 iterations, apply Barsky and Sims, and we get a distribution for the share of variance of output and other variables, consumption and so on, explained by new shocks. And this is going to be the corrected estimate. Our point here is not to say that the bias is upwards or downwards, because it can be either way. It's to provide a more reliable estimate. What we do is to work with consumption, labor, output, and trade balance data from the framework tables for a bunch of countries. And for the first variable in the block, which is basically using a Cholesky ordering, it's going to be the most exogenous variable relying on the small open economy assumption. This is going to be either TFP or foreign interest rate, which is the US interest rate of the 2-year T-bills, or country-specific terms of trade, which are calculated using Comtrade and the World Bank pink sheet. The estimation must be sequential in the sense that we can only choose one of these variables in the VAR, because if we put them together, we will be creating a foreign block, but they could be intertwined. So we just choose one of them. And then for each of these, we have different set of countries where we have developed countries and developing countries according to the World Bank income categorization, which goes from 1 to 4. Developed countries are those from 1 to 3, and those with 4 in terms of highest level of income are those that we consider developed. Okay,
Miguel,
so what
the bootstrap after bootstrap, because you talk about this small sample bias, and I thought that bootstrap basically fixes the standard errors, but it doesn't solve for consistency, right? If you have problems of consistency, you could still have problems of consistency and have biased results, even if you bootstrap them, right?
Exactly. Our second bootstrap is actually not trying to address the consistency issue. It's rather that in time series where you have a trend and when you apply a bar to them, even a single bootstrap method will give you biased results. That's also proved by Killian and Lukepol in a nice paper about that. Yeah. Okay.
Interesting.
Fair enough. So let me provide the bootstrap after bootstrap corrected estimates. We have here the bias, but the point here is again not showing the bias upwards or downwards. But in Killian and Lukepol, they showed that it can be either way. It's just to provide more reliable estimates. And the point is that the share of variance of output, these are all share of variances of output, explained by new shocks to TFP, are relatively the same in developed and developing countries, but is higher in developing countries for new shocks to foreign interest rates than in developed, as well as for commodity in terms of trade. Okay, so these are just the distributions to show the same that I just said. These are the new shocks to TFP, and these lines represent the share of variance explained by new shocks to it in both types of countries, whereas there is a relatively important difference, 6 percentage points for interest rate, and I think 8 percentage points for commodity terms of trade. So when we study what is behind these differences, we jump into just plugging into a simple OLS estimation our share of variance is explained by new shocks to either foreign interest rate or commodity terms of trade, and a bunch of controls, including a dummy for the level of development. What do we find here is that for the foreign interest rate, let's focus on regression 4. The higher the net foreign asset position is, the average net foreign asset position is, the more the higher the share of output variance explained by new shocks to foreign interest rate is. But more importantly here, and this could have different explanations, but this one, which is more at least stylized, is that when domestic credit provided by the financial sector, which we interpret as financial inclusion, is higher, the lower is the share of output variance explained by new shocks to foreign interest rate. And for commodity terms of trade new shocks, if we focus on regression 4, countries with more commodities total trade, meaning exports plus imports over GDP, have a larger share of output variance explained by new shocks to commodities. This is obvious. But more importantly, when we consider the stock's market cap as a share of GDP, the larger this is, the lower is the share of variance explained by new shocks to commodities. When we change this variable for derivatives as share of output, the total size of derivatives transactions, these results are even stronger and better. So we interpret this as development of financial markets, which we're going to map into a model, and see what are the channels that allow us to explain those facts. The fact that financial inclusion, more financial inclusion gives you less importance of new shocks to interest rates, and more financial markets, perhaps more access to derivatives markets give you more less importance in the new shocks to commodities in explaining variance of output as well as other variables. So we build a simple model based on Drescher and Tenreiro, which is a small open economy with augmented technological progress, sectors, final goods, and commodities. And what we change compared to Drescher and Tenreiro is that we break down households into two: financially included households, standard households, and non-financially included households, which are basically hand-to-mouth or non-Ricardian households. And we assume that there is a partial hedge in terms of commodities in the derivatives markets, which is that you can hedge a fraction of the price side, and this is exogenous. There are, for each of the shocks in the economy, there are two types of disturbances: the unexpected one and the new shock. So the preferences are standard, actually. It's just you consume final goods and you provide labor to both sectors, and it's labor augmented. These are just standard GHH preferences. Financially included households can either consume or invest. When they invest, they have to pay the typical investment adjustment costs and also depreciation. And if they borrowed before, they have to pay that foreign debt, which is this one. And their income comes from capital lent to either sector one, which is final goods, or sector two, which is commodities, and from working in both sectors. And obviously they can borrow in the form of issuing one period non-state contingent bonds in financial markets. And they can provide capital and labor to both sectors, whereas non-financially included households can only consume. They have no means of saving or providing capital whatsoever. And their income then comes only from labor in each of the sectors. And their total labor is supplied to either final goods or commodity sector. So here is where I think it's more interesting, where is that the production side, you have firms that produce the final good, and they use labor and capital and also intermediate inputs, specifically commodities. And then the commodity sector produces such commodities. This P tilde is the relative price of commodities in terms of final goods, i.e. the terms of trade, and they use labor and capital. So they both have standard CRS production functions where the final goods also uses commodities as inputs. Now, the things that I'm highlighting in blue are the important parameters of the model. One is gamma, the mass of financially included households. Two is P tilde, and P tilde matters because this is the price of commodities that the firm faces. Which firm? Both firms, the one that produces it and the one that consumes it. Obviously, the gap between the usage of commodities and the production of them is going to be exported. So this price follows the following process, which is partial hedging. You can hedge exogenously. I mean, obviously this could be made endogenous, but it doesn't add up to a lot to our model. You could hedge a fraction psi of the price, such that tomorrow the price of the commodities that you sell and in these markets or that you buy are the price of today. And another fraction is not hedged. You cannot hedge that. If you map that into prices and quantities, it's the same as having access to a limited amount of forward contracts, right? So the economy faces a debt elastic interest rate, as very similar to the one Gustavo showed. This is the only tweak here, is that the higher the commodity price is, this eta is going to be negative. So the lower is going to be the risk premium. This is usually for commodity exporting economies. And these are all the shocks that we have. The point here is that we have shocks to TFP, to a growth rate of TFP. Typical cycle is the trend shock. and to the prices of commodities. And they are broken down into unexpected contemporary shocks and the new shocks, right? We can identify this with Bayesian methods. This is just to close the economy. So let me jump into the solution. We do a baseline because we have a bunch of countries. And what we want to see is what happens with the share of variance explained, the share of output variance explained by new shocks and contemporary shocks when we play with these two key parameters: financial inclusion, i.e. the share of household financially included, and the share of commodities that you can actually hedge in terms of prices. And this comes from the fact that we found in the regressions that these are crucial to explain why more developed countries have less output variance explained by new shocks to falling interest rates and new shocks. So this is our main finding here. The dotted lines are the output variance explained by contemporary shocks, and the ones in blue are for output, the ones in red are for consumption. They are monotonically decreasing in both gamma and psi, and for the more strong lines, they are also decreasing, and the strong lines are the share of output variance, blue ones, and the share of consumption variance, red ones, explained by new shocks. In the left figure to foreign interest rate, and in the right one to commodity terms of trade. And they are also decreasing, but rather quicker than what it happens for the contemporary shock, and in non-monotonical way. So what we are computing now is how it affects the ratio of consumption volatility over output volatility. What we have found is that when you move those things together, this to the right, this ratio will go down, and it can actually get to be lower than 1, which is welfare increasing. And the channels behind that is that obviously, if you have more access to financial markets, you have more access to consumption smoothing. But what is aside from that is the fact that how many households can participate in standard borrowing and capital accumulation, and how much access do you have to hedging your commodity prices in an environment where otherwise they are really volatile, which is what typically happens in commodity markets. So yeah, I think I'm gonna stop here just to have your questions. But please feel free to ask me whatever you consider.
Thank you, Miguel. We have 3 minutes for questions. Let me start. So one thing I would like to see the impulse responses for news and non-news shocks, because I would think that financial constraints at the firm level might be relevant, right? You might respond to investment to a news shock, but you don't have any cause effect yet to a news shock. So the mechanism that affect you might be really different and interesting to see in the model.
You want to see the one from the model, Jorge?
No. In the data to build up the model, So I would expect the news shocks to have different transmission mechanisms to investment, right? Consumption, cost.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, for instance, here are new shocks to the foreign interest rate. This is just the mean of the new shocks. We haven't computed the confidence interval, but it's a negative response, as you might expect. And it's sharper in developed countries, but it recovers quicker. Whereas in developing countries, it's like more persistent, and it kind of explains that. That's the most we can do. But I agree with you that the model should match these input responses. So that's what we are working on right now. For commodities, I don't know if we have it here. I'm sorry, I didn't. No, I have it here. Yeah, it's expansionary, both in developed countries and also in developing countries. And the point is that
news shocks, right? Both.
These are news. Yeah, I'm not showing contemporary.
So, for example, you have labor responding less in developing. Is it right?
Yeah. Labor responds less in developing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So things like that, financial frictions at the firm level. The price is going to increase. You could start building up production ex ante, but financially constrained firms won't be able potentially. So things like that I was thinking.
Yeah, no, you're right. We have to think about that. I agree. Yeah.
Any other question?
I had one with respect to the regressions. I mean, like it's the one in which you put like the share of variance that was explained of output variance that was explained, for example, for terms of trade, and then you regress that on news about, for example, TFP, and you control for the level of financial development of the country, something like that. Yeah, that one.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe not exactly that. Well, it's still like.
Or this one.
Let me see. Trade over GDP.
Okay. I mean, probably you're thinking of this slide where this is the dummy you're thinking about, right?
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe like there is like the impact, or maybe I'm missing something, but maybe like the impact of news, or like how much they explain news of the output variance depends, of course, like on like the impact will depend on the level of development. So it's not that you will control for the level of development, financial development, but by the interaction between the two. I don't know if you get me.
Yeah, like of course. I agree with you because I mean they're intertwined too, no? For instance, when we put the development dummy and the financial development, at the end it disappears, and it's because we have find collinearity here, collinearity. So that's why we at the end choose to have the one that is more I think enlightening. But point taken, if we do interaction, actually we have done it, there could be some non-linearities there too.
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe like basically like it's not, maybe for example, both countries are affected, but one is like, it's just that the elasticity is different, something like that.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Yes, yeah.
Perfect.
Okay,
thank you guys for your comments. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. Let me try to share the screen here. I forgot to mention that your co-author was here, Miguel, right?
Yeah, of course. Mario is here. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention. Thanks for showing up. So, can you see the screen? I guess now you can see the screen. Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This paper is co-authored with Peter Karayani, Juan Olaya, and Alvaro Silva. Alvaro, I believe, is in the audience as well. It's titled Commodity Shocks and Production Networks in a Small Open Economy. So we know, and there exists still some debate, but some good evidence coming from important papers, that shocks to terms of trade are really important for business cycle fluctuations, especially in emerging countries. We've had recently many papers studying trying to understand the transmission mechanism of these term trade shocks, and papers by Miguel and Gustavo were going that direction as well. We have that the three most studied channels are the wealth channel, right, the cost channel, and which is something that Gustavo discussed before. There are all other channels like sectoral trade imbalances studied by David Cohn and authors, but we believe that there is one channel that's still not well studied in detail, and we believe it's relevant to think about. And we, while I'm trying to highlight the differences with the literature and with the previous papers as well, is that what is the role of production networks, right? So we know that, I mean, we saw in the papers by Gustavo and Miguel that there was kind of domestic connections, that the commodity were providing intermediate inputs, right? So there was that connection, but there is also the case that that commodities are also important users of intermediate inputs, right? So in a way, the commodities and other industries are all interconnected upstream, downstream. And we're going to try to empirically and then theoretically try to think about this, whether this transmission mechanism is relevant, and how we can understand the small open economies, business cycle fluctuations from that perspective. So we think about the following question. What is the role of domestic production networks? Selling intermediate inputs from commodities to our sectors, or buying intermediate inputs, commodities, buying from any other sector in the economy? How important these shocks are in amplifying, these networks in amplifying these commodity price shocks? We're going to focus in a sample of 18 commodity exporters. We're going to have some sector country panel regressions in which we're going to try to show different facts, but just to highlight briefly, we're going to highlight and document the centrality of these commodity sectors, upstream, downstream. We're going to try to build measures of commodity price shocks. We, at this stage, we're not accounting for what Miguel showed us before, like news versus non-news shocks. And later, we're going to think about how these shocks transmit upstream, downstream. Gustavo already showed us and gave us intuition in the downstream propagation. We're going to try to emphasize the upstream propagation here. And then we're going to develop a small open economy production network model, super simple, just to try to understand what mechanism could be explaining what we observe, okay? A preview of the results. So we find really large network effects if we compare to the own effects of the shocks across sectors. And the largest effect what we find is upstream. When we think about upstream, so upstream is like commodity, and then commodities buying from another sector. There's sector J is providing intermediate inputs to commodity. So in that the arrow going up is that commodities buying from sector J, and therefore because commodity demands more or demands less, sector J that supplies intermediate to commodity is going to move with commodity. So we find that that's a very relevant in the data. We will find downstream propagation that is coming basically from the cost channel that Gustavo highlighted, on prices slightly and not super strong, but not on quantities, which is something that we will try to we're going to try to reconcile both. So we're going to build a multi-sector small open economy, and as I said, for now this is work in progress. So for now we're just trying to qualitatively understand the mechanisms. We don't have enough quantitative work done yet. We're working on that currently, but the model is basically just to try to understand the amplified upstream propagation that we observe, and try to understand the mitigated downstream propagation. And two things are going to be crucial. One, that the shocks that we're going to see should be mostly demand-driven shocks that are going to increase the demand from commodities to other sectors. So this upstream, the demand from commodity to sectors, therefore the supply of sectors to commodity, is going to be relevant. And then we're going to find that input substitutability is going to be relevant in playing a role as well, and mitigating potentially the downstream propagation in the cost. So even though your marginal cost might increase because you use commodities, well, it might be the case that you can substitute for labor or capital, which is not explicitly in the model, or you can substitute for other inputs. So that it's a mechanism that qualitatively can explain the result. Let me now move to the data. So what we use is we use detailed information on commodity exports and prices for a sample of 60 countries, and that's initial data. In the end, we only have 16 countries because we use different data sets. But what we have is we have a bunch of different commodities that belong to different sectors, different industries in the economy, when we think about 2 or 3 digit industry classification. We will also have sectoral data for 33 industries from the OECD or World Input Output. We have evidence for both to try to understand what happens to sectoral value added, sales, or exports when we have these commodity price shocks. And then we also have macroeconomic data to control for exchange rates, spreads, financial factors, trading balances, etc. After combining all these data sets, we have in the OECD data sample 16 countries for the period 95 to 2001. Unfortunately, the data is not as large as we would like to because there are changes in industry classification. So for now, the benchmark data ends in 2009 or 2011, depending on the data set. But we have a good group of small open economies that export commodities. The first stylus fact is that this is kind of obvious that the mostly commodities that we have, these products, belong to three industries in our OECD input-output data set. Agriculture, mostly mining, and also we have foods product or tobacco. This is the fact that most of these commodities, say in the agriculture, mining, or food, but mostly in agriculture and mining, these products are mostly exported. So if we look at the value from the data set from Fernandez, the value exported to the total value of industry production is quite high. So this is comparing, just to see consistency, the data at the product level and then the production data at the industry level in the input output, right? So we do see that a large fraction, on average of 50% of exports of production is exported in mining, and about a 21% in agriculture, much lower in food. And this is the second stylus fact, which is that, and this is sector one is agriculture here. This is the production network. This sector three is foods, and then we have the sector two somewhere here. That one is going to be mining in Argentina as an example. So those sectors, and this is the domestic production network, are super interconnected to other industries. So we can see mining providing a substantial amount of intermediate inputs to sector 7, which in this case I don't have in the top of my head, and also sector 19, which might, and then the arrow indicating providing intermediate inputs, but you also see arrows coming to commodities because commodities also use a substantial amount of intermediate inputs. In the next table, I'm going to highlight more precisely how they are connected, but this figure intends to show that these three commodity industries are highly connected upstream and downstream. This one is the table that I was talking to you before. In terms of downstream centrality, we see that in most countries, the agriculture, mine, and food are in the top. Say here, for example, this number will say that agriculture and mining are in the top 10 of central industries from a downstream perspective. Just to simplify this table. So say, look at the number 9 and 6 for downstream. That means that most industries domestically use a lot of agriculture and mining products in the production. Therefore, we would expect this downstream cost mechanism to be relevant. But we also find that in terms of upstream, and especially the mining industry, mining is also super central in the economy. So mining sectors use a lot of financial services or wholesale trade, professional services, or other manufacturing industries in their production as well. So they demand a lot. And finally, the other thing we want to highlight quickly here is that the commodity price shocks that we have, even though they are highly correlated across countries, they are not so correlated across sectors. So we could think about and talk about a sectoral shock. So shocks that are relatively independent for mining, agriculture, and food sector. That's why we treat them as sectoral, not as an aggregate shock. And we study how they propagate through the network. So in terms of the identification scheme, we use a standard structural VAR approach to identify the shocks, assuming that in small open economies, commodity prices here are taken as given and in the small open economy, but assuming that they follow another regressive process. So the shock will be that epsilon. Here we don't account for new shocks, as we discussed before. This is just surprises that shocks that affect contemporaneously only commodity. There are no shocks that contemporaneously from other variables affects commodity. So we're going to interpret that as a commodity price shock. And Here we have below the link to the input responses to try to see how that affects macro variables, and they look very reasonable and in line with what we'd expect. But besides that, what we want to highlight is the following. So within a country and across sector, you see relatively low correlation in the shocks. So for example, the pairwise correlation between food shocks and mining shocks is very small, or between food, these are processed food, right? So these are like more complex type of oils or meat or products that are related to food. They have a relatively low correlation with agriculture, similar between mining and agriculture, although that is relatively higher than the other one. But it's still much lower than the cross-country correlation, which is about 0.9 when you look at the cross-country correlation, which is highlighted by Fernandez and others as well. So that's the intro. We still have 10 minutes, so I try to give maybe I was too long on the intro on this, but now what we want to do is to try to take these identified structural VAR shocks and see how they propagate and affect sectoral characteristics, right? So in this regression, which is in log levels, we also have in differences in the appendix, or we also control, thanks to Gustavo's comments, we also control for in our specification for lags of the dependent variable. But here we have the Y, which is the dependent variable, could be log value added, gross output, or prices against country time controls, sectoral controls, and also the shocks, right? So this is the commodity price shocks, and this is going to be the upstream propagation of the shock and the downstream propagation of the shock, which I briefly explain here. We use the input-output connections embedded in that network graph that I showed you before, and this is measuring the importance of sectors as users of intermediate input in the Leontief inverse network, and this is the inverse Leontief that details how you're connected to commodities when you use them as intermediate, and then we interact the price of commodity with that downstream connection to see the effects. We do the same for the upstream, so to see how much commodity buys from you. So we look at both, and then we try to understand how that propagates, right? So as I said in the intro, and I have just a few minutes to talk about the evidence, we mostly find upstream propagation positive. So commodities demand more, commodities produce more, while all the industries that provide inputs to commodity also do better because they need to provide intermediates to commodity. This is stronger for non-tradable sectors, which we would expect as well. This is domestic internal propagation here. Upstream, we don't see much evidence of downstream, although we do see evidence on prices. And you can see that more clearly in the word input-output dataset evidence. This is just the same regression, but with different data sets from the word input-output. Upstream propagation is stronger, and we see some evidence on prices here. So you see that there is some evidence on price. No, that's real, sorry, that is real. We do some evidence on price. So we do see here that there is upstream and downstream propagation on prices, which is something interesting as well, that we do see evidence on price, the cost shock highlighted by Gustavo, but we don't see much effect on the quantity side. Okay, so just to summarize, we do observe consistent demand side spillovers through the production network, but we don't see much effect on quantities through the downstream cost channel, although we do see effect on prices. So I just have like say 2 or 3 minutes now, so I will quickly go through them all and highlight the main mechanisms. Here, this is a small open economy and non-tradable sectors and one commodity sector. This is just to explain qualitatively what's going on. This is the production function of all industries. Even commodity will have this complex production process using labor, using intermediates, and then using a bundle of intermediates from different industries. This is going to highlight the network here. The omegas ij are the weights in the network in the green graph that I showed you before. Consumers are going to be very simple. There's going to be domestic demand for all goods, but also there is international demand. And we're going to assume that the international demand is mostly what drives the price of commodities, consistent with the evidence that we have. So what are the network propagation effects? This is the cost channel, the price channel that we do find evidence. The price channel is mostly driven by the domestic Leontief inverse, which captures the downstream propagation. This is right here, and that's consistent with the evidence on prices. Okay, we don't see much of an effect on quantities, as I said, but we're going to discuss that later. We highlight a different element here, that these commodity price shocks propagate differently to productivity shocks. And that's mostly because this is just exogenous price, the small open economy, right? There is no feedback on prices of commodities internally. And finally, the main equation so far to qualitatively explain the data is the following. How do quantities respond? Quantities respond because of the cost channel. So you have larger cost of production, then you shrink your production. However, there is the upstream demand shift, right? So which is related to the wealth effect. Here, the wealth effect is not just coming from consumer demand, but also from sectoral demand, because the commodity is going to demand from many other sectors, and that is amplified by the upstream Leontief inverse modified, right? And there is also this term in the middle that it's about reallocation. Firms are going to reallocate away or towards commodities because of the relative change in prices, and that can also mute the downstream propagation channel if the elasticities are larger than 1, and can amplify the upstream propagation channel. So that would be, so far, and I'm running out of time, our main hypothesis now. The flexibility or the substitutability between inputs plays an important role in accounting for the muted downstream effect and amplify upstream effect, but also the fact that there is this mostly demand-driven price shocks that amplify the standard wealth effect through the firms demanding more commodities. So as a conclusion, commodity sectors are central suppliers and users in the domestic production network. We do see a strong upstream propagation, demand-driven commodity shocks, and so far our qualitative explanation is related to production substitutability that mitigates one channel and amplifies the other in the presence of demand-driven commodity price shocks. In the future, we will go more quantitative, but this is all we have so far. I think we have 3 or 4 minutes for questions. Thank
you. Jorge, I know that you want to go more quantitatively in the future, but I think this is a comment that I made you for the SETI conference. But
yeah.
Do you have like an idea of how important, like, I mean, if you were to write like a simple production networks model, and you were to derive like this equation that you have at the end, and you put a number to this elasticity of substitution, do you have a sense of how big or this upstream or like the effect of the elasticity of substitution on the upstream effect can be? I mean, does it have enough power to explain what you see in the data? That's basically my question. Like the sigma I, for example, how far can you push it up? Like,
okay,
I don't know. That's basically a question.
That's something we could do. We haven't done it, but you're saying basically a sufficient statistic, or just use these equations to kind of see whether what is the value of the elasticity and whether it makes sense. Because we do have the value for this, right? We do have this. We do have that, and we can see what makes sense. That's exactly. A good idea.
How high could the elasticity? How high would the elasticity have to be to explain what you have in the data, and basically if that implied required elasticity makes sense or not, or it's something illogical.
But I also think that some of your mechanism might be playing a role here, because factor utilization might be relevant as well. So it's not something we're planning to have yet, but it might explain muted responses on quantities as well. So maybe that's why it would be interesting to do the exercise you suggest.
Yeah, and actually that was like my other questions, like basically what, I mean, because if you have like, for example, CES with elasticity of substitution different than 1, it's something, even though it has a structure, it's a different type, it's a kind of like a reduced form model, because you have some sort of like micro foundation of that CES bundle in the background. So what exactly do you have in mind? Like, for example, why I mean, this is something like more deep, but basically like factor utilization or something like, I don't know, capacity constraints, whatever, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's, well, if you have well-measured data on quantities and prices, it should be technological different from factor utilization and capacity constraint. But if you don't, if you're not able to identify the elasticity well, you're gonna have confounding factors, as you said, right? So the elasticity might be showing up these other elements, which is something that is also super relevant to have in mind. I think, thank you for that.
Jorge?
Yes.
I have only one comment, but I don't know. Maybe it's not very pertinent to your paper, but I feel like it's needed to be said, which is the way I understand it, and I totally agree with at the end, is like commodities are sectorial shocks that end up, commodity shocks are sectorial and end up affecting more certain sectors, right? Which are the ones that are upstream. What I wanted to say is that I feel like it's true and it's more in the direct channel of commodity prices in themselves, rather than it's important that in these countries, small open economies that are usually commodity exporters, it tends to happen a lot that commodity prices affect the risk premium. So then commodity prices, for instance, when they go down, the risk premium goes up a lot. And if firms that are downstream, they have a larger mass of firms that are financially constrained than those that are upstream, that indirect channel may end up actually hurting more downstream firms. I don't know if it's something you can take into account, but maybe it's just to break down the claim into the effects of commodity prices.
And that's also relevant to the exchange rate you mentioned, right? So we could interact exchange rate with the imported intermediate share, for example, things like that. But yeah, that's a good point. Like here, you could think about interacting this with financially constrained proxies or things like that. We control for the spread, but at the aggregate level, what you're saying that might affect heterogeneously some sectors, and those might be upstream, right? So that's what you're saying, basically.
Yeah, exactly what you said. If you control for leverage, you can get a great cleaning out of that for that channel.
I mean, we do control for spread, but we don't control for that interacted with the sectoral, which is what you're saying, basically.
Yeah, I think both papers are pretty interesting.
Yeah, maybe we should talk more, the three of us, later.
Sure.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. I think we run out of time. Anyone has any more comment? Thank you, Yvonne, for hosting. Thank you, Gustavo and Miguel, the co-authors that came as well.
Thank you, everyone, for hearing.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Great organization by the Universidad del Rosario.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're being recorded. Yes. Great job. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you guys.
See you.
Thank you.